On the morning of June 25, 1950, General MacArthur flew from Tokyo into Suwon Airfield, 15 miles south of Seoul. There, he was met by President Syngman Rhee, the ROC Minister of Defense, and the U.S. Ambassador. Borrowing a car, MacArthur's entourage drove north to a point overlooking a railroad bridge about to be blown over the Han River. The capital was burning, and artillery rounds were bursting on its north side. The road south was full of refugees. The remnants of the retreating ROC 1st, 7th, and Capital Divisions were fleeing the city as the North Koreans lunged in from the north to take the port of Inchon. It was here MacArthur made the decision to turn the tide and request authority to commit ground troops and air support from President Truman. He already had a plan in mind, and it required an amphibious landing in the enemy's rear. He told them, "If I had a Marine division, I'd land them here and trap the NKPA between a hammer and an anvil." After 2 months of fighting, MacArthur would finally have his chance. Making matters worse, Inchon had no beaches, just miles of seawalls along the waterfront. They also had no way of knowing how many North Koreans guarded Inchon. MacArthur's greatest difficulty, however, lay in convincing the Joint Chiefs of Staff to approve an amphibious landing. Even though MacArthur enjoyed great successes using amphibious landings in World War II, many people believed that they could no longer be effective in a world with nuclear weapons.
It was a dangerous maneuver, and the senior military officers, particularly the Navy, absolutely did not want that maneuver executed. They was concerned that it would be a failure. There were several things against it. One, of course, was a tide. The tide in that area was a 30-foot tide, and you have a short, a narrow envelope in getting in and getting the troops off without being sitting there in the middle of the mud. Senior military officers were sent from the Chiefs of Staff of the U.S. Army to talk him out of it. And when he got through selling it, he went back and he kind of got talked into it, so that eventually they agreed to do the amphibious operation. If it hadn't been MacArthur, it wouldn't have occurred.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff did not believe that Cates could have the 1st Marine Division ready for the Inchon assault in accordance with MacArthur's timetable. They exacerbated the problem by not immediately giving the green light. Cates put his career on the line by guaranteeing the JCS that the unit would be ready for the Inchon assault. On August 22, 1950, when 1st Marine Division Commander Major General Oliver P. Smith arrived in Tokyo with his planning staff, he did not know that MacArthur had already set September 15 as D-Day at Inchon. He learned that to float an amphibious force up to the seawalls encasing Inchon required a 33-foot tide, which occurred only on September 15 and again in mid-October. Smith doubted whether he could complete the planning in the time allotted, but MacArthur insisted he must. He expected Smith's 1st Marines to spearhead the assault, followed by Major General Edward Ullman's 10th Corps and the Army's 7th Infantry Division. Neither Smith nor JCS agreed with MacArthur's risky Inchon-Seoul operation. Even the 7th Fleet Commander, Admiral Arthur Struble, had his doubts. But Smith had no say in the decision, and the JCS merely voiced their objections and let MacArthur have his way. MacArthur chose Major General Edward M. Almond, a man with no prior experience with amphibious landings, to lead the attack on Inchon. Almond was MacArthur's chief of staff, an irritating and conservative Army officer who objected to assaulting a defended city against unknown odds and unpredictable tides. As events later proved, MacArthur would have been better served by leaving Almond on staff and giving full command to Smith. But putting a Marine general in charge of an Army Corps would have upset the JCS. 10th Corps, made up of the 1st Marine Division and the understrength 7th Infantry Division, prepared to launch their assault on September 15. 5 days before the assault, Marine aircraft began a preliminary bombing of their targets. MacArthur had designated 2 landing points for the assault. Red Beach was close to the heart of Inchon and was surrounded by a stretch of seawall that required Marines to use scaling ladders to breach. Blue Beach was in a suburban industrial area south of the city and had a direct connection to the main highway system. Colonel Ray Murray's 5th Marines would land at Red Beach and then await reinforcements from Wolmi-do before attacking through Inchon. Meanwhile, the newly arrived 1st Division Marines, led by Chesty Puller, would land at Blue Beach and head directly for Seoul's main highway. At 17:30, after a heavy bombardment, and on the evening high tide, both contingents of Marines hit their assigned beachhead.
Most of the Marines had to go up a ladder and over a 20-foot seawall. But my group went through a hole that the ships had blown through the seawall, and it was happened right where there was a little trailway going from the edge of the water up about 30-foot incline. And me being in the 3rd vehicle there, the first one made it fine, but the ruts that the wheels were in was low, and the center between the ruts was high, and the second amphibious truck bogged down, and we couldn't get around them because it was such a narrow pathway or roadway and high banks on the sides. So when the second truck bogged down, we all stopped, and we bailed out there and started up a steep bank, and there was a 4-strand barbed wire new fence at the top of that bank. Well, there was a machine gun, enemy machine gun active, and it slowed us down as well as the barbed wire fence slowed us down. And somehow somebody come up with a pair of side cutter pliers and cut the 3 bottom strands, and why they didn't cut the top one I don't know, but all of a sudden this truck behind me decided he thought he could climb the right side of the truck over part of the bank, and he starts right at a whole bunch of us. I was about 15 feet beyond that fence before I realized I'd even moved. But we went about a mile and climbed the hill and secured it for the night.
After bypassing the city's initial defenses, the Marines took Inchon with relative ease. Troops moved from building to building along Inchon's coast, sweeping away enemy snipers and machine gun positions. Murray's 5th Marines quickly moved up through Red Beach's left flank and took Cemetery Hill. By 2000, they had captured the right flank at Observatory Hill and continued pressing forward. As the first day's fighting came to an end, UN soldiers found themselves in control of Inchon's beachhead and most of the city.
We went in D-Day at Inchon there and went up towards Seoul, and the battle for Inchon didn't last very long. There were not many troops there at all. We went up towards Seoul.
By the following afternoon, the assault phase of the operation concluded in total success, with only 24 Marines killed and 174 wounded. General Smith placed Korean Marines in the rear to mop up Inchon and pushed on to Seoul. Once again, the Marines held up their end of the bargain. Now it was General Walker's turn to keep the ball rolling. With reinforcements landing daily, UN forces inside the Pusan Perimeter now numbered 150,000. Combined with better artillery and armor, they now held a major advantage over the KPA. The North Korean army had also used the lull in fighting to replenish their numbers and now had close to 70,000 soldiers. A great number of these, however, were South Korean conscripts that had been captured during the invasion. Even though these men did not want to fight for their oppressor, few defected or deserted. Most of these North Korean soldiers were now stationed around the Pusan Perimeter, where they hoped to make one last desperate push to drive the UN forces out of Korea. Little did they know that MacArthur had planned a push of his own. MacArthur anticipated that the KPA would immediately send reinforcements to Seoul after learning of the Inchon landings. Hoping to take pressure off 10th Corps, MacArthur ordered General Walker's 8th Army to break out of Pusan on September 16th. When the date for their attack came, Walker's force was well prepared. North Korean troops around the perimeter were hit hard as UN soldiers surged across the Nektong River. Air Force F-51s chased after fleeing KPA units, dropping napalm before they could escape. Walker's men were held up by heavy fighting outside of Wei-Guen, but they soon managed to encircle the communist force and break through the resistance. From there, the front opened up, and UN soldiers were able to reclaim much of the land they had lost to North Korea's invasion. The attack moved so quickly in some places that UN soldiers chased retreating KPA troops in trucks. When the communist soldiers turned to fight, Walker's men would unload and clear the area. Then they would get back into the trucks and continue with their mission. The UN forces advanced so quickly that they soon outran their supplies and were forced to halt for 2 days. When fuel and ammo finally reached them, once more, they raced after the fleeing enemy. On the night of September 26th, Walker's men united with 10th Corps. MacArthur's hammer had finally hit his anvil. Without much resistance, the road to Seoul would prove something entirely different.
We didn't just walk 21 miles from Inchon to Seoul. You go up one hill and down the other, it's a lot farther that way. And it seemed like every hill that I saw in Korea that we were going over was bigger than the hill before us.
As 10th Corps drew closer to Seoul, they faced increasing numbers of North Korean soldiers. Unlike previous battles at Inchon and Kimpo, these engagements proved both hard-fought and extremely violent.
Well, at times it's pretty rough. I saw my lieutenant look up over a dike, take a bullet right in the middle of his head. And that was the first injury that I saw. And I mean, it was close to me. And we had a corporal that was shot in the groin while taking a prisoner just a day or two before that. He wasn't very far from me. But it wasn't like some of the Pacific battles were that we had heard about and had a little training about. But we knew it was serious business.
Even though many of the KPA's soldiers were in retreat, the North Korean command managed to send some reinforcements to Seoul. Puller's 1st Marines pushed along the Incheon-Seoul highway toward Yeongdon-po, brushing off the first of several NKPA counterattacks. On September 21st, Puller found the enemy massed with Soviet tanks on Seoul's outskirts. While Company A worked around the enemy's flanks, the rest of the regiment blasted the tanks, routed the force in front, and walked into Yeongdong-po in the morning. The 1st and 5th Marines then crossed the Han River. There, they were joined by the 7th Marines and the 7th Infantry Division and pushed into Seoul. On paper, it looked like a cakewalk. In reality, it was a bitter battle for every block of the city and every square inch of the surrounding hills. In an attempt to slow the UN forces, KPA troops took up positions in the hills along Seoul's western border. The fighting was intense, as Marines had to utilize air support and tanks to break through. Still, they were barely able to drive the North Koreans from the peaks. The cost in blood and lives was high. The 5th Marines suffered over 85% casualties attempting to take Hill 66 outside of Seoul. With only 33 men still capable of fighting, the surviving 5th Marines led a desperate bayonet charge up the hill and managed to take the peak. Once inside Seoul, the Marines quickly went to work. The city had to be taken block by block, as North Korean soldiers put up resistance at seemingly every intersection.
As far as Seoul now, I think my company probably was going up the main street of Seoul. And we, one afternoon, had passed through about a 20-foot break in a sandbag barricade across the street. We got about 100 yards past there and had a 4-man fire team about 100 yards ahead of us, and we knew at least 2 of the 4 was wounded. And we held up until we got our fire team back. Then, and all this time, we were receiving orders from our battalion executive officer to pull back behind the barricade. So after we got our fire team back, we pulled back behind the barricade for the night. And at midnight that night, 5 tanks come down the street after us. Our tanks had been given orders to go back several hundred yards into more safety during the night. We had a bazooka man that went out in front of that sandbag barricade and managed to knock out 3 of the 5 tanks that night.
The T-34 tank, which had seemed nearly invincible at the beginning of the war, was now vulnerable to attack thanks to improved weapons and experience.
He was trained enough that he knew the weakest part of that tank was the treads, and he managed to knock the left tread off the 3rd tank first, and then the 1st tank, and the 2nd tank was bottlenecked, and he got it. The 4th and 5th tank managed to turn around and get away.
When we left what was called the Pusan Perimeter and moved north, we moved on north of Seoul, and Seoul was already taken from the landing at Inchon. We moved on north of Seoul, and we were going to cross 38th parallel. Of course, we stopped there because no word had been given to cross it yet. Then the word came across 38th parallel, and the 1st tank moved out and hit a mine. So that kind of slowed things down a little bit. They pulled back. And there was infantry there with us, said all the time. But that mine went off, they kind of started pulling back a little bit, not getting up too close behind the tank. Makes sense. But next day, we started to move up, and there was quite a bit of rifle and machine gun fire, but you couldn't see a thing. It was foggy. You could hear it all, but you couldn't see a thing. You know, you see maybe 50 meters. And they had been told, I say they, our people had been told from some prisoners that they were going to put some tanks on us the next day. Well, that was the morning we crossed. After they had some engineers up to clean out the mines. And that was probably what the firing was. They were trying to keep the engineers away. But we moved across, and you stop, and you could hear tracks. You could smell diesel smoke. We had gasoline engines. It was kind of eerie, really. We knocked out 8 tanks that morning, 8 of them. One of them, you know, you always want to kind of protect yourself, so one vehicle was on the road, a tank was on the road, with his gun tube pointed to the south, just in case. T-34 come down the road around just a very slight curve, ran right into him. Just, you know, nose to nose. And of course we had tanks on both sides of them, so that didn't last very long. But it was pretty interesting, and once we got through that, then it was back to the same thing with infantry. And most of the time, at that time, the Koreans were whipped. The North Koreans were whipped. They did not want to stand and fight. Once we got into North Korea, we just go where you want to. We had no problem with them.
On September 25th, KPA soldiers began pulling out of Seoul. General Almond immediately announced the city's liberation, even though many North Koreans continued fighting. The Inchon landing and Seoul's liberation proved to be the high-water mark of MacArthur's career. September 29th, the old soldier greeted South Korean President Ri and other dignitaries as they re-entered the city. Thanks to MacArthur's bold attack, the Korean War had taken a turn in the UN's favor. As North Korean soldiers everywhere were being driven back beyond the 38th parallel, the only question that remained was how far UN forces should pursue them.